Star Wars Battlefront II, the old one, saw release onto the PlayStation Portable in 2005 from LucasArts and Pandemic Studios, and apparently it did well enough that the PSP would get 2 more Star Wars Battlefront games to its credit, while the rest of the gaming world would have to wait until 2015, where EA would unleash their own brand of Star Wars Battlefront, which falls outside the purview of this, whatever you want to call it. Star Wars Battlefront II, naturally being ported onto a handheld unit with significantly lesser resources than the consoles and PCs it originally inhabited, is a considerably compromised version in terms of features, content control, and overall performance. And I will be blunt here. This is not the best way to play this classic game. The Xbox and PlayStation 2 versions are out there in the wild for relatively cheap, and you can still get the PC version via Steam and GOG.com. Those are probably your best bets in experiencing this game the way it's best played, shall we say. You can probably play it on that Steam Deck thing if you have one of those and you wanted a handheld version. Maybe. Not quite sure. Don't have one of those. But let's table all that and talk about this PSP version of Star Wars Battlefront 2. Which again, this did well enough to warrant 2 more games on the handheld, which we'll probably touch some other time. A quick rundown of Star Wars Battlefront 2 for those unfamiliar with the game. You control a random grunt, trooper, whatever you want to call it, for either of the 4 major powers of the time. The Republic, the Separatists, the Empire, or the Rebellion. Depends on the era. Shoot down other grunts, win the battle by capturing all the command posts in a map or depleting enemy forces of their reinforcements. To make things interesting, there's also a capture the flag variant where you capture a flag of sorts and dump it into a thing to score points, and there's some modes on certain maps that let you hunt indigenous species or something to that extent. You start with 2 types of infantry, the standard trooper and a heavy weapon dude, but can unlock more as you score more points on the battlefield. Score enough points and you can play as a hero character for your faction, which varies depending on the setting. The hero character, whether it be a Jedi or enhanced grunt, can keep their health up by killing other grunts and getting stuff done. But try and get stuff done quickly because heroes are only around for a limited time, and once they're gone, you'll have to re-earn them to get to play them again. There are also a couple maps dedicated to space battles, where you'll fly either a fighter, bomber, interceptor, or landing craft, your choice, and attempt to cripple the enemy capital ship while fending off their own forces. Now in the console versions, you could actually board the ship and disable its systems from within, but on this PSP version that isn't possible because the only ship interior that has been retained is the main hangar bay. So the landing craft, which you would use as a spawn point in the other ship, serves no real purpose unless you want a real heavy ship with heavy armor and heavy weapons to fend off against the fleet and the ship and such. So you have to take the cap ship from the outside. First by taking out the shields, then taking out key systems, which will earn you points. And whoever reaches the win quota worth of points wins the round. Of course, there's also a capture the flag variant. So what made the cut into this PSP version? Well, you have the 2 modes of play from the home version. Galactic Conquest being the pseudo-strategy game type thing where you control fleets of starships and try to conquer all the systems on the board, earning credits to purchase additional troop types and other bonuses to help you out. And the instant action mode, which is your straight up pick a map and area to fight for supremacy, that sort of thing. Battlefront 2's big single player campaign / story mode, Rise of the Empire, didn't make the cut here. In its place, you have Challenges, which is divided into 3 mini campaigns of sorts. Imperial Enforcer, where you kill off alien species such as Ewoks and Gungans. Rogue Assassin, where you knock off specific targets. And Rebel Raider, where you steal items from Imperial bases and return them to home camp within the time allotted. For what it's worth, they're fairly distinct and focus on different aspects of gameplay. Imperial Enforcer, for example, focuses on pest control. Hello, use a Jar Jar Binks, I'm gonna roast you now. The number of maps have been cut down significantly, with only a handful making the cut. Space Battles, the major addition to Star Wars Battlefront 2, is cut down to 2 maps you could play, one for the Clone War era and one for the Galactic Civil War. Most, if not all, of the voice bites have been removed. You only have a couple grunts at most. Tutorials are basically slideshows instead of videos. There's virtually no video to be found here. The overall graphical quality has seen a bit of a reduction in quality. And of course, the controls are somewhat compromised, obviously. Since the PSP doesn't have the same layout as a typical PlayStation or Xbox gamepad, only 2 triggers and a single, dodgy analog nub, some concessions were made to make the game somewhat playable on the PSP. In fact, when you start a new profile, you're given the option of one of 4 preset button configurations to act as your controller setup, and if you don't like that one that you've taken, you could always change it to another one in the options, no problem. In any event, learning how to control shit in Battlefront 2 takes a little while. Certainly took me a little while to get used to the somewhat reduced control scheme, and to tell you the truth, with the exception of the space battles, I don't think I ever truly adjusted to the reduced PSP controls. I've never been a fan of the PSP analog nub thing. It's right up there with the N64 analog stick and Intellivision controller as one of the worst fucking contraptions I ever used. So having a game that uses that for movement exclusively is pretty painful. Thankfully, I'm playing this on an emulator, which is why the footage is looking a bit more pristine. But even then, yeah, they try to make it work, and I'll be fair, sometimes it does work with the nub for movement and the face buttons for free look, and space battles controlling your fighter hasn't seen much compromise in control, so eventually you'll get used to it, but naturally, don't expect the same level of play as the home versions. This one takes a little while to get going. Other than that, however, the core gameplay is somewhat retained, save for some of the stuff they had to take out or change around. It's still pretty much the same Star Wars Battlefront II game. That game is still pretty damn good at what it does, letting you control a grunt to blow up other grunts with a variety of grunts, weapons, and vehicles. The action for the most part holds up exceptionally well, with some fairly brief bouts of chugging when things get perhaps a bit too hectic. The load times on the UMD are kinda shit, but that's to be expected on the PSP. But Galactic Conquest is still a grand old time. The challenges are kinda fun for a lark, and if you got the means, there's even multiplayer support, so have at it. The PSP version of Battlefront 2 ain't too bad looking, all things considered. In terms of the overall visual quality, the drop-off isn't too far off as far as the textures and models are concerned. I expected much worse going into this, and this is up to about PS2 standards. Almost. I do find the widescreen somewhat jarring in that it's less widescreen and more, let's just chop the top and bottom parts of a 4x3 display to make it appear widescreen, so it's more zoomed in than it should be, and you have less of the lay of the land. Whereas in a proper widescreen display, you'd actually be able to see more of the picture, but whatever. The space sequences look pretty good, particularly in terms of the various ships and the stellar settings of sorts. Nothing but good things to say about the graphics, surprisingly enough. Unsurprisingly, however, Star Wars Battlefront II sounds like Star Wars. That is to say, you have select pieces of the John Williams composed scores from all 6 Star Wars movies circa 2005, assuming you have the music turned on, of course. A lot of the familiar sound effects have been used and sound good. The voice chatter has been dropped almost entirely. You'll have to pay attention to text blurbs that will appear on the top left corner for information, none of it really relevant though. Again, stuff that needs to be dropped for this game to exist on the PSP, but not necessarily a huge loss. Star Wars Battlefront II for the PSP is not the ideal version of the game to play. That goes without saying, I suppose. And there are some compromises made to get it to work on the PSP in the first place, but in all honesty, this is a perfectly adequate conversion that makes do with what's available on the hardware, gives you a number of control options to make the experience somewhat palatable, and the additional challenges mode is a fun time to be had on the go. It's not my preferred flavor of Battlefront, but it's still largely playable and still perfectly functional, so yeah, this one's okay.